kid behind the counter picked the wooden train up with one hand, turned it over, looked at the scuffed bottom, and set it back on the glass. "Yeah, old wooden toy, handmade looks like. We don't really take toys unless they're in the box. I can do $5. Arthur Griswold stood on the other side of the counter, 78 years old, the green wool flat cap his late wife Elaine had bought him at the Brattleboro Farmers Market in 2003 pulled down over his ears, the small wooden pull toy locomotive sitting on the glass between them, and watched a 22-year-old in a Green Mountain Pawn polo look at the toy his father had brought home from a farm auction in 1969 and see $5 worth of old wood. "That was my daddy's," Arthur said, quiet. "He bought it for my boy." The kid, Emmett by the crooked name tag, shrugged and pushed the train an inch across the glass with his index finger. "Sure, 5, final." Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The small wooden pull toy locomotive Arthur Griswold had just set down on that counter was worth $58,000. It was not a folk art carving. It was not a homemade Christmas gift. It was a Tower Guild toy, made in South Hingham, Massachusetts in approximately 1845 by the first organized toy manufacturing cooperative in the history of the United States. The Tower Guild was established in 1830 by William S. Tower, a woodworker in South Hingham, Massachusetts, who organized a cooperative of local craftsmen to produce wooden toys, pull toys, wheeled animals, miniature vehicles, toy soldiers, and small wooden trains. Before Tower, American children played with imported toys, mostly German and English, or with rough homemade playthings carved by their fathers. Tower's cooperative was the beginning of the American toy industry. Every wooden toy, every tin toy, every plastic toy, every action figure and board game and electric train set in every toy store in America was, in some way, a descendant of what William Tower started in a workshop in South Hingham in 1830. The locomotive on the counter was about 6 inches long. It was carved from a single block of white pine, hand-shaped with a draw knife and finished with a spoke shave, the tool marks still faintly visible under the paint. The paint was original, a deep red on the boiler, black on the smokestack and wheels, gold leaf on the trim lines, worn to bare wood at the edges from decades of a child's hands. The 4 wooden wheels turned on hand-whittled axles. A cotton pull string, frayed and shortened from use, was knotted through a small hole in the cowcatcher. And on the bottom of the locomotive, under the scuff marks, under the floor wax buildup from years of being dragged across hardwood floors, was a small stamped mark, barely visible unless you knew to look, a letter T inside a shield, the Tower Guild mark, the oldest maker's mark in the history of American toy making. Fewer than 20 authenticated Tower Guild toys were known to exist in private and institutional collections worldwide. The last comparable Tower Guild locomotive to surface at auction at Skinner in Boston in 2018 had sold for $54,000. Arthur's father, George Griswold, had bought the locomotive at a farm auction in Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1969 for 50 cents. He had bought it not because he knew what it was, but because his grandson, Arthur's son Peter, was 4 years old, and George believed that wooden toys were better for children than plastic ones. Peter had dragged the locomotive across every floor in the Griswold house for the next 6 years. Then he had outgrown it, and George had put it on the mantel, and it had sat there for 55 years. This is the story of how Arthur Griswold walked into Green Mountain Pawn on a Tuesday morning in January with $390 of trouble in his head, and walked out with the discovery that the 50-cent toy train his father had bought at a farm auction, the toy Peter had dragged across the kitchen floor until the paint wore off the wheels, was one of the oldest surviving American-made toys in existence, stamped on the bottom by the man who started the American toy industry. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Arthur. Arthur George Griswold was born in 1946 in Brattleboro, Vermont. His father, George Griswold, had been a carpenter, not a contractor, a carpenter, the old kind, the kind who built things from wood with hand tools because that was what a carpenter did. George had built houses, barns, cabinets, stairs, porches, and church pews in Windham County for 43 years. His mother, Vivian, had taught first grade at Academy School for 31 years. Arthur went to Brattleboro Union High, graduated in 1964, did 4 years in the Army, 2 at Fort Devens, 2 in Germany, came home and spent 37 years as a boiler technician at the Brattleboro Retreat, the psychiatric hospital on the hill above the river. Married Elaine Holbrook in 1968. One son, Peter, now 57 and living in Keene, New Hampshire. Elaine had died in 2023 of pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis, the fastest kind of slow. The oil tank was the problem. The 275-gallon fuel oil tank in the basement of the small Cape on Burge Street had sprung a pinhole leak in November. The oil company had red-tagged it, no deliveries, until the tank was replaced. The plumber had quoted $390 for a new tank installed. Without oil heat in a Vermont January, Arthur was burning wood in the parlor stove and sleeping on the couch beside it. His retreat pension was $1,240 a month. Social Security added $2,060. After property taxes, insurance, electric, fuel oil, when he could get it, his blood pressure and arthritis medications, and groceries, he had about $70 of slack in a good month. He did not have $390. He could have called Peter in Keene. Peter was a high school shop teacher whose wife worked part-time at a veterinary clinic. Arthur had not asked his son for $1 in 14 years. He was not going to start over an oil tank. For 7 days, he burned wood in the parlor stove and slept on the couch. On the 8th morning, Tuesday, he went to the mantel. The wooden locomotive had been on the mantel since 1975, the year Peter, at 10, had decided he was too old for a pull toy, and George had set it on the mantel between the clock and the photograph of Vivian. It had been on the mantel through Arthur's entire marriage, through Elaine's 35 years in this house, through Peter's childhood and departure and visits home. It was part of the room. It was part of the house. It was so familiar that Arthur had stopped seeing it years ago, the way you stop seeing a doorknob or a light switch. George Griswold had bought the locomotive at a farm auction in Deerfield, Massachusetts in September of 1969. Arthur remembered this because he had been there, 23, just home from Germany, standing in a field beside a collapsing barn, watching his father poke through boxes of old tools and household goods. George had found the train in a box of kitchen items, wooden spoons, a rolling pin, a breadboard, and a small wooden locomotive with faded red paint and a cotton pull string. George had held it up and said, "This is for Peter," and paid the auctioneer 50 cents. George had given it to Peter the following week. Peter had been 4 years old. He had dragged the locomotive across the kitchen floor, the living room rug, the front porch, the driveway, and, on one memorable occasion, through a mud puddle in the backyard. The red paint on the boiler had worn to pink and then to bare wood at the high spots. The gold leaf trim lines had worn away almost entirely. The wheels had been scuffed flat on the bottoms from being dragged instead of rolled. The pull string had been broken 3 times and re-knotted shorter each time. Peter had loved the train the way children love things, completely, destructively, without any thought for what it was or where it had come from or what it might be worth. George Griswold had understood this. George had been a man who believed that toys were for playing with, not for keeping. He had made Peter a wooden sword once, and a wooden boat, and a set of wooden blocks, and he had watched Peter play with all of them until they broke, and he had considered this the correct use of a toy. When Peter outgrew the locomotive, George had set it on the mantel not as a display piece, but as a reminder that a 4-year-old boy had once dragged a red train across this floor, and that the floor was better for it. Arthur sat at the kitchen table that Tuesday morning with the locomotive in front of him and the plumber's estimate beside his coffee mug, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He wrapped the train in a dish towel and drove to town. The 2000 Subaru Outback had 209,000 miles and a rust hole in the left rear quarter panel that Vermont winters had been working on since 2014. Arthur drove the 1.5 miles to Green Mountain Pond on Canal Street and parked at 9:10 on a cold, gray January morning with the temperature at 11 degrees. Green Mountain Pond sat between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The bell jangled as Arthur stepped inside. Emmett was behind the counter with a beanie on and wireless earbuds in, blowing on his hands. The shop's heat wasn't much better than Arthur's. "Help you?" "I've got an old wooden toy, a locomotive. My daddy bought it at a farm auction in '69. "Let's see it." Arthur unwrapped the train from the dish towel and set it on the glass. Emmett picked it up with one hand, turned it over, looked at the scuffed bottom, the worn paint, the chewed-up wheels, and set it back. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight, because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 22-year-old, and Arthur Griswold had not cried in front of another human being since Elaine's funeral in 2023. The bell over the door jangled again. A woman came in, early 60s, tall, angular, with short silver hair and sharp blue eyes behind round tortoiseshell glasses. She wore a dark navy wool peacoat over a cream cable-knit sweater and corduroys, brown leather ankle boots, and a brown leather satchel. She had the slightly wind-blown look of a woman who had driven a long way on back roads. She came 2 steps inside, glanced at the counter, and stopped. She looked at the locomotive. She tilted her head. She took another step. Her eyes moved from the boiler to the smokestack to the wheels to the cowcatcher with the frayed pull string. Her eyes narrowed. Something changed in her face, not surprise, but focus. The focus of a woman who had spent 40 years in museum storerooms and auction houses and who recognized the shape of a particular kind of American toy the way a birdwatcher recognizes a particular silhouette against the sky. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear and precise, with the clipped cadence of old New England. "Sir, is that a wooden pull toy locomotive?" Emmett looked up. "Old guy's selling. $5. The woman did not look at Emmett. She looked at Arthur. "Sir, my name is Dr. Margaret Hale. I am the curator of American folk art and material culture at Historic New England. That's the oldest and largest preservation organization in the region, and I consult for Skinner Auctioneer's American Folk Art Division. I am in Brattleboro today because we are surveying a private collection of early Vermont painted furniture in Dummerston. I stopped in here because I always stop in antique shops and pawn shops. Would you permit me to examine that locomotive?" Arthur found his voice. "You're asking me?" "It's yours, isn't it?" "It was my daddy's. He bought it at a farm auction." "Then yes, sir, I'm asking you. And I would ask you, please, not to let anyone set this toy on its side or spin the wheels. The axles are hand-whittled. They're fragile." Emmett straightened the locomotive to sit on its wheels without being told. Dr. Hale set her satchel on the counter and opened it. She drew out a pair of thin white cotton handling gloves, a 10 times jeweler's loop, a small LED pen light, a soft chamois, and a leather-bound notebook. She pulled the gloves on finger by finger. "May I?" Arthur nodded. Dr. Hale lifted the locomotive with both gloved hands, one under the boiler, one under the tender, and set it on the chamois. She examined the body. She ran a gloved fingertip along the boiler, the worn red paint, the bare wood showing at the high spots. She looked at the smokestack, turned on a lathe, black painted, the paint worn to gray at the tip where a child's fingers had gripped it. She looked at the wheels, hand-shaped, scuffed, flat on the bottoms. She looked at the pull-string hole in the cowcatcher. She turned the locomotive over. She held the LED penlight at a grazing angle across the bottom. The bottom was a mess. Scuff marks, floor wax buildup, a small gouge from being dragged over a threshold, the accumulated evidence of a toy that had been played with hard for 6 years by a child who did not know the meaning of the word careful. She brought the loop to her eye. She moved the penlight slowly across the bottom, reading the wood surface under the wax and the scuffs. She moved the light an inch to the left. She tilted the locomotive. She read the bottom again. She went still. "Oh," she said, very quietly. Then, "Oh my word." She set the locomotive back on the chamois, right side up. She set the loop down. She set the penlight down. She took off her glasses, polished them on her sweater, put them back on. "Mr. Griswold, Arthur Griswold. Mr. Griswold." On the bottom of this locomotive, underneath the scuff marks in the floor wax, which have actually helped preserve it, there is a small stamped mark. The mark is a letter T inside a shield. It is approximately 1/4 inch tall. She paused. "Mr. Griswold, that is the Tower Guild mark." Arthur shook his head slightly. "I don't know what that is, ma'am." Dr. Hale nodded. "Mr. Griswold, in 1830, a woodworker named William S. Tower in South Hingham, Massachusetts, about 90 miles from where we're standing, organized a cooperative of local craftsmen to manufacture wooden toys. The cooperative became known as the Tower Guild. It was the first organized toy manufacturing operation in the history of the United States." She paused. Before Tower, American children played with imported toys, German tin soldiers, English wooden dolls, or with homemade playthings their fathers carved from scrap wood. Tower saw an opportunity. He organized his neighbors, men who were skilled woodworkers, coopers, chair turners, into a cooperative that produced standardized wooden toys for commercial sale. They made pull toys, wheeled animals, miniature carts, toy soldiers, and small locomotives. They sold them through general stores and peddlers throughout New England and as far south as New York and Philadelphia. The Tower Guild operated from approximately 1830 to the 1880s. It was the beginning of everything. She picked the locomotive up and held it in the fluorescent light. The worn red paint caught the light with the soft matte depth that only old milk paint has. Not shiny, not flat, but warm, the way old wood is warm. This locomotive is carved from white pine, the standard material for Tower Guild toys. The paint is milk paint, the standard finish. The wheels are hand-shaped on a foot-powered lathe. The axles are hand-whittled. The smokestack is lathe-turned. The boiler is hand-shaped with a draw knife and finished with a spoke shave. I can see the tool marks under the paint. Every detail is consistent with Tower Guild production methods from the 1840s. She looked at Arthur. "Mr. Griswold, authenticated Tower Guild toys are among the rarest and most valuable pieces of American folk art in the market. Fewer than 20 are known to exist. Most are in institutional collections, the Smithsonian, Historic New England, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Winterthur. The last comparable Tower Guild locomotive to surface at auction, at Skinner in Boston in 2018, sold for $54,000. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. "This locomotive, Mr. Griswold, with the Tower Guild mark, the original milk paint, the hand-carved white pine body, and the honest playware from a child who loved it. At professional appraisal through Skinner's American Folk Art Division, with authentication from Historic New England, would be valued between $50,000 and $68,000. Conservative estimate, $58,000. Emmett's beanie had shifted slightly on his head. His earbuds were out. His hands were at his sides. I was going to say 10. I meant 10. Arthur didn't look at him. He was looking at the locomotive on the chamois, the worn red paint, the scuffed wheels, the frayed pull string, and he was seeing Peter at 4 years old, dragging it across the kitchen floor on a Saturday morning in 1970, the pull string in his fist, the wooden wheels chattering over the linoleum, and George standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee, watching his grandson play with the 50-cent train, smiling. George Griswold had bought a Tower Guild locomotive for 50 cents because he believed wooden toys were better for children than plastic ones. He had not known it was a Tower Guild. He had not known the T in a shield on the bottom. He had not known the toy was 124 years old when he bought it. He had known it was well made. He had known the wheels turned. He had known Peter would like it. He had been right about all three things. "My daddy paid 50 cents, Arthur said. His voice was not steady. He said wooden toys were better for children. Doctor. Hale looked at him for a long moment. Your father was right, Mr. Griswold, and the child who played with this toy proved it. The wear on this locomotive, the bare wood where the paint wore off, the flat spots on the wheels, the shortened pull string, that wear is not damage. In the folk art world, we call it evidence of use. It tells us this toy did what it was made to do. William Tower made these toys to be played with. Your grandson played with it. Tower would have been pleased. She handed Arthur her card. Mr. Griswold, take your time, talk to your son. But please, sir, do not leave this toy in this shop. And please, do not clean it. Do not repaint it. Do not wax it. The scuff marks and the floor wax on the bottom are protecting the maker's mark. 180 years of a child's love is the best provenance a toy can have. Arthur nodded. He watched Dr. Hale wrap the locomotive in the chamois and hand it to him with both gloved hands. Arthur took the train. He held it in both hands, the small wooden locomotive, 6 inches long, lighter than it looked, warm from the chamois. He nodded once at Dr. Hale. He walked out past Emmett without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in the outback with the engine running and the heater on full and the Vermont January pressing against the windshield, Arthur Griswold held the wooden train against his chest and cried for the first time since Elaine's funeral. He called Peter that night. Peter drove over from Keene the next morning, 45 minutes on Route 9, the same road Peter had driven 1,000 times. They sat at the kitchen table on Burge Street with the locomotive between them on the chamois, and Arthur told him the whole story. Peter, who was 57 years old and who had not thought about the wooden train in 40 years, picked it up with both hands. He turned it over. He looked at the scuffed wheels. He pulled the frayed string. He held the locomotive in his lap and said very quietly, "I remember the sound it made on the kitchen floor, the wheels clicking." "I remember too," Arthur said. "Grandpa gave me this?" "Grandpa bought it for you at a farm auction for 50 cents. He said wooden toys were better." Peter held the train for a long time. He ran his thumb over the bare wood where the red paint had worn away, the place where his 4-year-old hand had gripped the boiler 10,000 times, dragging it across every floor in the house. "I did that," he said, looking at the bare wood. "You did that," Arthur said. They called Dr. Hale at 9. Skinner Auctioneers sent a team to Brattleboro in February. The locomotive was examined under archival conditions at the Brattleboro Historical Society. The white pine was species confirmed. The milk paint was tested. Iron oxide red pigment in a cassin binder, consistent with 1840s New England production. The Tower Guild mark was photographed under UV light. The Tea and Shield stamp was confirmed against 3 other documented Tower Guild marks in the historic New England collection. The lathe-turned smokestack was matched to documented Tower Guild turning profiles. The hand-whittled axles were confirmed as period correct. Machine-turned axles did not appear in American toy production until the 1860s. Authentication was unanimous. Skinner listed the locomotive in their March American Folk Art sale. Bidding opened at $25,000. It closed at $55,000. After commission, the Griswold family received $47,800. Arthur paid for the oil tank. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He had the chimney repointed. It had needed it since 2017, and Elaine had mentioned it every fall. He sent Peter $15,000 and told him to use it however he wanted. He set up a trust for his 2 grandchildren. He bought Elaine a new headstone. The cemetery's standard granite marker had already started to model in the Vermont acid rain, with her full name and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother." She kept the house warm. He did not sell the locomotive. After the Skinner authentication, Dr. Hale had offered Arthur a choice: sell it outright at auction or loan it to historic New England for permanent display. Arthur had chosen the loan. The locomotive went on display in the organization's Toys and Childhood Gallery at their Haverhill, Massachusetts property in April, set in a custom case on a small wooden track, pull string visible, the worn red paint, and the bare wood grip spots and the scuffed, flat-bottomed wheels all presented as they were. The placard read, Tower Guild Pull Toy Locomotive, circa 1845. South Hingham, Massachusetts. White pine, milk paint, hand-whittled axles. Tower Guild Maker's Mark, T and shield, on underside. The Tower Guild, established by William S. Tower in 1830, was the first organized toy manufacturing cooperative in the United States. This locomotive was purchased at a farm auction in Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1969 for 50 cents by George Griswold, 1920 to 2002, of Brattleboro, Vermont, for his 4-year-old grandson, Peter. The playware, bare wood at the grip points, scuffed wheels, shortened pull string, is evidence of a toy that fulfilled its purpose. On loan from the family of Arthur G. Griswold, Brattleboro, Vermont. Peter drove his father to Haverhill for the dedication. Arthur wore the dark suit he'd worn to Elaine's funeral. He stood in front of the case for a long time, looking at the locomotive. The worn red paint, the bare wood grip spots, the scuffed wheels. "You love that train, Peter," Arthur said, quiet enough that only Peter heard him. "I did, Dad. Your granddad bought it because he believed wooden toys were better." "They are," Peter said. "They last." Arthur nodded. This one had lasted 180 years. It had been made in a workshop in South Hingham by a man named Tower, who believed that American children deserved American toys. It had traveled from South Hingham to a farm in Deerfield, to a farm auction, to a carpenter's hands, to a 4-year-old's fist, to a mantle, to a pawnshop counter, to a museum case. And the bare wood on the boiler, where Peter's hand had worn the paint away, the evidence of a child's love, the evidence of use, was now the most valuable surface on the toy. William Tower had made the locomotive to be played with. Peter had played with it, and the playing had not diminished the toy. The playing had completed it. A letter came to Arthur's post office box in June. It was from a 69-year-old woman in Hingham, Massachusetts, named Carolyn Tower Pratt, a direct descendant of William S. Tower. She had seen the Skinner listing. She wrote that the Tower family still lived in Hingham. She wrote that the Tower Guild Workshop, a small wooden building behind the family homestead on Main Street, was still standing. She wrote that her family had been trying to locate Tower Guild toys in private hands for decades, and that this locomotive was the first new discovery in 11 years. She enclosed a photograph, a daguerreotype from approximately 1850, showing the interior of the Tower Guild Workshop. 4 men at wooden benches, wood shavings on the floor, rows of small wooden toys on shelves behind them. On the nearest bench, in a row of 5, were small locomotive pull toys, red boilers, black smokestacks, cotton pull strings coiled beside them. One of those locomotives was now in a museum in Haverhill, Massachusetts, with the bare wood grip spots of a 4-year-old boy from Brattleboro, Vermont, and a 50-cent price sticker from a farm auction in 1969. Arthur had the daguerreotype reproduced and framed. It hangs on the mantel on Burge Street, in the spot where the locomotive used to sit. And the next Saturday morning, back home in Brattleboro, Arthur sat down at his usual booth at the Brattleboro Food Co-op Cafe with his 2 oldest friends, Howard Bemis and Kenneth Thayer, the way he had every Saturday for 23 years. Howard looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the Reformer, Arthur." "Heard that. Wooden train, huh?" "Wooden train." Kenneth shook his head. $5. $5, Arthur agreed. The 3 of them laughed, the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that train and said, $5. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.